Tormund Giantsbane stood in the courtyard of Winterfell with snow swirling around him, the ancient castle walls looming like silent witnesses to the audacity of the moment. He had been many things in his life: raider, warrior, friend, and foe, but never had he imagined himself wearing a crown. And yet, the battered ring of bronze and old iron resting in his hands spoke to possibilities that stretched far beyond the walls he stood within. He wore the thick furs of his people, his hair and beard gleaming ginger in the pale winter sunlight. Behind him, a gathering of free folk and northerners alike formed a ring of watchful eyes. Some were curious, others skeptical, and a few were quietly afraid. This was not how any of them had imagined the future of the North. But Tormund, who had lived beyond the wall in the land of eternal winter, who had fought side by side with the people of Westeros to turn back the army of the dead, had dreams that no southerner could fathom. He had survived 1,000 perils. If he could outlast the Night King, he thought, then forging a new alliance between wildlings and northerners was just another obstacle to be battered down. He turned the band of metal in his large, calloused hands, remembering the old songs the free folk used to sing of Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall. Mance had believed that free folk were the equals of any man south of the wall, that a shared humanity could triumph over ancient hatreds. He had died for that dream. Tormund had fought for it too, in his own way, though never so boldly as to claim leadership for himself. But times changed, and so did men. The long night had united them all against a common enemy, but in the aftermath, the old cracks in the north had begun to show again. The free folk roamed restlessly, uncertain of their place in a kingdom that did not truly welcome them. Some of the northerners, grieving and wounded, found reason to blame the strangers from beyond the wall for shortages of food, for strain on the land, for any number of ills. Tormund had watched this division widen, day by day, and realized that if no one took charge, the peace they had fought so hard to establish would wither like a late autumn flower caught in the first frost. He lifted the crown, a crude thing by southern standards. It had been hammered by a skilled blacksmith from both sides of the wall. Iron from the shattered remnants of the castle's old gates melted and fused with bronze taken from the battered shields of free folk who had died in the war against the dead. Heedless of the swirling wind, Tormund raised it overhead, turning in a slow circle so that all might see it. His voice, rough and booming, echoed off Winterfell's walls as he said, "I never wanted to lead. Mance Rayder was the king once. Jon Snow led us to fight for the living. But now we're in a world with no Night King and no great war to bind us. Winter's breath is still cold, the land is still harsh, and my people, the free folk, still have need of a home. You," he pointed a thick finger around him at a ring of northerners who watched, "you have bled beside us. You have lost just as we have lost. It's time we put an end to the old ways, the old hatreds." The northerners looked to each other, uncertain. Some, those with open minds and fresher memories of the unstoppable hordes of whites, nodded in cautious agreement. Others turned their heads away, scowling. Tormund inhaled, searching for the words that might sway them. He would not be a polished orator like Mance or the southern lords who spoke with careful courtesy, but perhaps the people would appreciate sincerity over flourishes. "So I say we do what we must. The free folk need a king, and the north needs a king. Someone who won't sit on a throne of iron in a city of snakes far away. We're all from the north. More than that, we all bled for it." Then, with a determined glint in his eye, Tormund placed the makeshift crown upon his head. He looked as though he himself were surprised by the weight of it, but his broad chest expanded with a new resolve. "I am Tormund Giantsbane, king in the north. But if you'd have me, I'll be your king too, no matter if your bones were born inside the wall or out." A hush fell, broken only by the wind howling through the scorched battlements of Winterfell. Slowly, a rumble began. Someone clapped, another cheered, a third raised a sword in salute. Among the free folk, there was a roar of approval. They recognized Tormund's bravery, his generosity, and the warm, albeit crude, way he led them. Among the northerners, there was more hesitation, but still, they nodded or lowered their eyes with a grudging respect. In time, More voices joined in the cry, as the swirling snow danced around Tormund in a ghostly spiral. And so began Tormund Giantsbane's reign as the first king in the north since the defeat of the Night King. A reign that would be shaped by the same savage ferocity, loyal friendship, and irrepressible humor that Tormund himself embodied. He found he disliked throne rooms, so instead, he took his seat in the Great Hall, using only a carved wooden chair lined with thick pelts instead of the austere, high-backed seat of the Starks. He insisted that the free folk mingle with the Northerners at the long tables. For the first few days, the tension was thick as fresh-forged steel. The two peoples had never truly broken bread on equal terms. The free folk were accustomed to a life unbound by feudal oaths, while the Northerners were used to a rigid social hierarchy and lords presiding over them. Yet Tormund's warmth helped. He would wander between them, occasionally slapping the shoulders of a Lord Glover or Lord Serwyn or even simpler men and women, regaling them with tall tales of his adventures beyond the wall. He would exaggerate for effect, describing battles with giants and wights, describing how he drank giant's milk, and the wild laughter that followed brought the slightest cracks of smiles to faces still mourning the tragedies of war. But even as Tormund was crowned, trouble brewed. Not all were so willing to submit to a wildling turned king. There were old lords who muttered behind closed doors. Where is Lady Stark in all this? Where is Jon Snow? And truly, Tormund could offer no good answer. Jon Snow, he knew, had gone beyond the wall for his own reasons, perhaps to find peace away from the politics that had consumed his life. Sansa Stark remained at Winterfell, quietly observing Tormund's doings with an air of guarded calculation. She was a woman who had seen the world, who had survived horrors Tormund could not guess. She had a pride in the Stark name, and she had no intention of seeing her family's seat slip away without a say. Yet Sansa had also grown to appreciate the free folk and what they had done for the North. She had grown to value the alliances that saved everyone from certain doom, so she listened and watched, measuring Tormund with her unblinking blue eyes. The days passed, and snows continued to fall. Winterfell was partially rebuilt from the ravages of the recent war, though some walls and towers showed the blackened scars of dragonfire. Tormund engaged every able-bodied man and woman, from both the free folk and the old northern families, to the labor of rebuilding the castle. If we're to live together, he reasoned in a voice booming enough to be heard from ramparts to the practice yard, then let us build together. He labored side by side with them, carrying heavy stones, hauling lumber, never once complaining of the biting cold. More and more, people saw not a savage foreigner but a bear of a man whose face split into a grin as soon as he lifted a mug of ale. A man who told children stories of cunning foxes and brave warriors, who knelt to speak to old men and women with the same respectful ear he would give a high-born lord. Slowly, the two peoples began to intermingle. Friendships formed in the forging fires of adversity. Where once a Stark soldier would sneer at a wildling's rough accent, now they'd spend the evening dice games sharing old war stories. Where once a wildling woman would roll her eyes at a northern lady's stiff courtesy, they now found common ground in discussing the best ways to tan hides or preserve meat through the winter. There was still tension, but Tormund's approach of daily feasts, crude but hearty, helped. His loud, boisterous laughter challenged the uneasy hush that had settled after so much loss. Still, all was not well in the north. Those who had recognized him as king did so out of gratitude for the free folks' contributions in the war and, to some extent, fear that rejecting him would reignite hostilities. It was a fragile acceptance. So far, no major northern lord had openly defied Tormund. But many had not openly bent the knee. A letter from House Manderley arrived after the first week, politely stating that the Manderleys had urgent matters in White Harbor and could not attend Tormund's call. House Serwyn replied with a terse acceptance, sending only a few riders to pay respects. The Umbers, whose lands were ravaged, had little choice. They had been nearly wiped out, and many of them were free folk survivors themselves now. The Glovers were more resistant, adopting a wait-and-see approach, sending watchers instead of envoys. Winterfell's Great Hall bustled with more activity each day. Tormund made a practice of hearing grievances, an informal version of the Southern Court, though in truth it was more a chaos of complaints and Tormund's brand of simplistic justice. If a wildling woman complained her goats had been stolen by a northern farmer, Tormund would haul the farmer in, listen to both sides, and then simply say, "We all need goats, but stealing from your new neighbors is a piss-poor way to show the love. Give her back double, or I'll leave you out at night with no cloak." Crude, perhaps, but fair by the standards of many. Sansa often sat quietly, intervening only when Tormund's decisions threatened to cross a line into something that would breed further bitterness. Once, a dispute arose about farmland near the Gift. A small group of free folk had built temporary shelters and begun to hunt on a parcel that House Serwyn claimed as its own. Tormund listened to the dispute in his usual posture, one leg thrown over the arm of his chair, but Sansa raised her voice politely. "We must ensure that our decisions do not sow resentment for generations to come," she said, turning to Tormund. "We can grant the free folk certain areas to cultivate or hunt, but we must also protect the property and livelihood of our established houses. If we do not, the next harvest may see us all starving." Tormund scratched his beard, looking more thoughtful than he usually did. "We all want to keep the peace, so we tell House Serwyn, show us the parcels that matter most to your livelihood, and free folk, you can take the forest beyond for hunting. We'll share the farmland because no one wants to see children go hungry. We're all in this together, or we'll freeze together." He shot a wry grin at Sansa. She merely nodded, acknowledging that his approach, while lacking a certain nuance, did indeed address the problem in a straightforward way. When the hearing was over for the day, Tormund gestured for Sansa to walk with him through the courtyard. They stepped out into the snow, the pale winter sun lying low in the sky. Tormund towered over Sansa, but her poise and bearing conveyed her own authority. "You do all this for what reason?" she asked him, folding her gloved hands before her. "Is it truly so you can claim a crown, or is there something else?" He looked at her, surprised by the directness. "I never wanted a bloody crown," he admitted, "but I'm good at fighting, good at surviving. My people need someone who'll stand up for them, someone the Northerners can't ignore. As for the Northerners, you need someone who knows the free folk, who can keep them in line, if there is such a thing as keeping them in line." He gave a rough laugh. "And maybe I owe it to Jon. He asked me once to help. He's not here now, so I'll help. If that means calling myself king in the north, so be it." Sansa regarded him carefully. Her red hair blew in the wind, nearly as fiery as Tormund's own. "It's not as simple as having a title," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The North is proud. It won't bend so easily, even if some of the smaller houses show deference now. You will need to make alliances, show you can rule as well as you can fight." Tormund nodded. He felt the full weight of the crown pressing on his head, though he wasn't wearing it at that moment. He said, "I'm no fool, Lady Stark. I need friends, and I need the respect of lords who haven't decided whether they want me gone or not." She raised an eyebrow, perhaps impressed by the realization that Tormund, for all his barbarian mannerisms, understood the game more than people assumed. "That's good," she said. "You have my ear if you need counsel. For the sake of the North, I would prefer we avoid another war." He nodded and pressed a hand over his chest. "I thank you, my lady." Word of Tormund's coronation spread across the north like a stray ember carried on a biting wind. Some laughed at the idea of a wildling king, certain that he would not last the turning of a moon. Others worried that it was an affront to the legacy of House Stark. And some, for all their pride, remembered the nights when whites raged outside the gates, when the living nearly lost all. To them, Tormund was a hero, or at least an ally who had proven his steel. The small folk, in particular, had little love for ongoing feuds. They only knew that Tormund had shared in the hardships, that he listened to their complaints without demanding large taxes or ignoring their plight. Tormund's popularity among the common people began to spread, surprising many a nobleman. Still, acceptance was not universal. One cold night, a band of men loyal to House Glover rode into Winterfell with a demand to speak to Tormund. He met them in the courtyard, flanked by a half-dozen free folk, men and women. The Glovers, bearing the sigil of a mailed fist, showed no deference. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache, looked Tormund in the eye and said, "We didn't name you King, Wildling. As far as we're concerned, our loyalties remain with House Stark." Tormund glanced at the free folk to his sides. A scuffle felt inevitable, but he raised a hand to still them. "You've come to talk or to threaten?" he asked. "If we wanted to fight, we wouldn't have announced ourselves," the Glover man said. "But we do want you to know we won't bow to a man who came from beyond the wall. You can claim the Stark seat if Lady Sansa allows it, but House Glover stands apart. We'll watch. We'll see how you lead. If you can keep peace, if you can feed our people through this winter, then maybe we'll consider your claim. Until then, don't expect us to kneel." Tormund let out a slow, heavy breath. "Kneel, don't kneel, it's all the same to me. But if your folk are hungry, or your land threatened, remember who fought for the living." "I did. The free folk did." The Glover men nodded curtly. "We remember," their leader said. "But memory doesn't always mean loyalty. Show us reason to follow, or we won't." Then they turned and rode away. Tormund stood in the snow, staring after them, aware of how fragile his hold truly was. Not long after that, a small council convened. Tormund needed advice on how to bridge these divides. In the solar, where a large hearth warmed the frosty stones, Sansa, Davos Seaworth, who had lingered in the north after the war, lacking any real place to go in the south, and a few others gathered. Tormund pulled up a chair that groaned under his weight. He gestured for everyone to sit, though council was a generous term for the ragtag group. Davos, rubbing his trimmed beard, spoke first. "Your Grace," he said, with only the barest hint of a respectful smirk. "The North is not like the southern kingdoms. It's a proud place, but also suspicious. If they do not see a reason to follow you, they'll stand by and watch until you fail. You need more than goodwill. You need alliances properly sealed." Sansa nodded. "Yes, and there are many ways to seal alliances. Marriage is often the easiest, though it is complicated in our case." Her blue eyes flicked to Tormund, measuring his reaction. Tormund, who had been in the middle of chewing a chunk of roasted mutton, nearly choked. "Marriage?" he said, half laughing. "Have you seen me? I'm as subtle as a charging mammoth, and the last woman I fancied nearly took my head off with a sword. I'm not sure marriage is the best path. Besides, who in the 7 bloody hells would have me?" Sansa's lips curved. "There are daughters of northern lords who might consider it if it meant securing peace. If you truly want to merge the free folk and the northerners, a marriage between a wildling king and a northern lady could send a powerful message." She hesitated, uncertain if Tormund had the capacity for the diplomatic niceties required. Tormund scratched at his beard, frowning. He thought of Brienne of Tarth, the warrior woman who had once fought alongside them. His heart gave a small pang, recalling her fierce eyes and strong arms. But she was no Northman's daughter, and she had long since departed Winterfell. As for others, the idea of a political marriage felt like stepping onto a frozen lake that might crack at any moment. Yet Tormund was not ignorant of how the world worked. "I'll think on it," he muttered, the corners of his mouth downturned. "But let's say we do that. It'll take time to arrange. What do I do to hold everything together before that time?" Sansa traded a glance with Davos. "You show leadership," she said simply. "You show them you can feed the North through the winter. You show them you can protect their borders. You show them that you honor their traditions as well as your own." Tormund let out a gruff laugh. "Honor their traditions? What? Like bending the knee and kissing the ring of every lord who wants to feel important?" Davos coughed. "Perhaps a more moderate approach, my lord. But attending to their concerns, respecting their hierarchies, yes, that will be part of it. Whether you like it or not, the North has a deep sense of identity. They'll not simply abandon their customs." Tormund leaned back, exhaling. "All right, so that's the road. What about the free folk? They're not used to kneeling to lords or making nice at fancy feasts. They'll say we're becoming the very thing we hated." His gaze flickered around the solar, searching for answers. Do we forget who we are? A new voice chimed in. Val, the so-called princess of the free folk, though no free folk would use such a term without mockery. She had come south with Tormund, having no wish to remain beyond the wall with so much left to settle here. We do not forget, Val said, her tone quiet but unyielding. We adapt. The free folk knew hardship, and we overcame it by being flexible, by coming together. If a marriage or a bow in a feasting hall helps us share the north and keep our children fed, then we do it. But we do not become them, we remain who we are inside. Her eyes met Tormund's, and for a moment, unspoken understanding passed between them. She had the regal bearing of someone used to admiration, but also the fierce independence of a free folk survivor. Tormund gave a single nod. "Aye," he said softly, "you're right." And so the plan, if it could be called that, took shape. Tormund would travel the north, meeting lords on their own lands, breaking bread with them, offering both peace and a promise of mutual defense. He would do this not as a conqueror, but as a neighbor. He would bring with him a band of free folk, chosen for their skill in hunting, forging, or healing, and demonstrate what they could offer the north if given a chance. And quietly, behind the scenes, Sansa would float the possibility of a marriage alliance. Val would gauge the reaction of the free folk, ensuring that no large faction felt betrayed by Tormund's willingness to engage in this southern custom. With the days growing darker as deep winter set in, Tormund prepared a small retinue. He took Val, Davos, a handful of free folk fighters, and a couple of northern men who had sworn to him, albeit with reservations. They set out on a journey through the snow-laden roads of the north, each step fraught with the possibility of ambush or mistrust, each day a chance to prove or disprove Tormund's kingship. Their first stop was Deepwood Motte, the seat of House Glover. The keep was nestled in dense forest, approachable by winding roads where tall pines stood laden with fresh snowfall. By the time Tormund's party arrived at the gates, the sky was turning a bruised purple, early evening settling in. Archers stood on the ramparts, torches flickering. Tormund bellowed up, "Open your gate if you would greet the king in the north." He said it with a grin, half serious, half challenge. There was a moment's pause before the gates were opened. The party rode into a courtyard lit by a scattering of torches. Glover men and women stood around with guarded expressions. Tormund swung down from his horse. He hated riding, having spent most of his life traveling on foot or with crude mounts. His back ached from the saddle, but he carried himself tall. Davos dismounted more gracefully, bowing slightly. Val remained atop her horse for a moment, regal and fierce, her blonde hair gleaming in torchlight. Lord Glover, a lean man in his middle years, approached. His expression was carved from stone. "Tormund Giantsbane," he said, not quite acknowledging his royal title. "You've come a long way in a harsh winter. Why?" Tormund tried to recall Davos's advice. He forced a friendly smile, ignoring the cold. "Because if you and I don't talk, that harsh winter might get harsher. We need each other, whether we like it or not." Glover studied him for a moment, then gestured for them to follow him inside. They passed through corridors of rough-hewn wood, the old banners of House Glover, displaying the mailed fist on red, hanging in subdued light. They came to a modest hall where a fire crackled in a large hearth. Tormund's party stood in a small cluster as servants brought mulled wine and bread. Tormund eyed the bread hungrily, but he remembered to watch his manners. He took the cup of wine, sipped it carefully. It was hot and spiced, burning a path down his throat. Lord Glover regarded them in silence before speaking again. "The North has known many kings. We once swore fealty to the king in the North. Then we bent the knee to the Targaryens. Then to the Baratheons. Then we named Robb Stark king in the North. Then we followed," he paused. "We have followed many. Now you say you are the king in the North, but from beyond the wall. Why should we trust you with that title, given all we have endured?" Tormund met his gaze. "Because no other king can claim to know the free folk like I do. Because I fought for the North when the dead came, and I lost men and women dear to me, just as you did. Because I don't seek to tax you into oblivion or rule you from some distant city. I'm here, standing in your hall, offering my hand. His voice was low but firm. I can't promise I'll be a perfect king, but I can promise I'll be a king who sees your struggles as my own. And I'll keep my word. Lord Glover's wife, a sturdy woman named Lady Barina, spoke up. We have heard you are a fair man, Tormund Giantsbane, though rough around the edges. We also know the free folk do not always respect boundaries. What assurance do we have that they won't raid our lands for cattle or steel? Val spoke before Tormund could reply. The free folk are not mindless raiders. We have families, children. We want to survive, not cause trouble. If you give us no reason to starve, we won't. We'll trade, we'll hunt in lands designated for hunting, and we'll hold to the truce. But if you push us away, if you treat us like animals, well, animals will do what they must to live. Tormund aims to prevent that. That's why he comes to you openly. There was a moment's silence. Davos added gently, we can help each other. Resources are thin after the war, but the free folk are skilled hunters and gatherers. They know how to live in the cold better than most. In return for your acceptance, they can guide your men to the best game trails, help fortify your defenses. This is not a matter of conquest. It's a matter of survival. Lord Glover rubbed his chin thoughtfully. He looked to his wife, then back to Tormund. I don't deny that what you say makes sense, but I won't bend the knee to you blindly. Show us that you can keep your people in line, that you can keep order in the north without turning it into chaos. If you do that, I'll consider your request for loyalty. For now, you're welcome under my roof. My men won't harass yours, but neither will we kneel. Tormund exhaled slowly, a swirl of relief and frustration. This was a start. He wasn't thrown out, but he wasn't fully accepted either. That's fair, he said gruffly. I'm not here to force you. He raised his cup in a toast. To the north. They drank, if not merrily, at least in mutual civility. When they bedded down for the night, Tormund found himself restless. He stood by a window in the guest quarters, looking out at the dark pine forests, the moonlight on the snow. His thoughts drifted back to the last time he had been in Deepwood Motte. He recalled that the Free Folk had once attacked and captured it under the leadership of Ygritte and Styr, the Magnar of then. That was a lifetime ago, in a world where the living had not yet faced annihilation. Could these old wounds truly heal? His reflection on the window's glass revealed a man more tired than he liked to admit. The weight of responsibility pressed upon his shoulders like a slab of granite. For all his bravado and jokes, Tormund knew he was fumbling in the dark. I hope John's proud of me, he mumbled softly, though there was no one to hear, or at least not ashamed. In the morning, they set out again, heading southward through the thick forests. They planned to skirt the edge of the Wolfswood, pass by a few minor lordlings, and eventually circle back toward Winterfell. Along the way, Tormund wanted to reassure smaller settlements that the free folk under his banner were not a threat. They encountered pockets of small folk who gaped at the sight of wildlings and northerners riding together. Some of the children pointed at Tormund's thick red beard and giggled, only to hide behind their mother's skirts when he looked their way. Tormund would simply laugh, wave his hand, and sometimes toss them small treats, dried meats or trinkets from the free folk. We're on the same side, little ones, he'd say, though they likely understood little. At some stops, the villages looked on them with hunger in their eyes, the winter being cruel. Tormund saw the lines of worry etched into the elders' faces and the stoic fear in the young. He remembered nights beyond the wall when a single storm could claim half a village. So he commanded that the free folk and northern soldiers share some of their provisions, enough to lighten the burdens. The small folk, in turn, offered what they could, furs or hospitality for a night's rest. Such exchanges knit small threads of trust. Word would spread that Tormund Giantsbane was not merely a marauder, but a man who cared if his subjects starved or thrived. Still, Tormund felt uneasy. He sensed eyes on them from the shadows of the trees. The north was vast, and not everyone would welcome this experiment. More than once, he caught glimpses of silhouettes slipping behind snow-laden branches. Whether they were bandits, disgruntled lord's men, or even rogue free folk who opposed Tormund's ways, he could not tell. but it reminded him that each step forward could end in bloodshed. They pressed on, day after day, forging a path through snowdrifts and icy streams. The nights they spent huddled near fires, with Tormund's retinue forming a ring around him for protection. Val, ever watchful, would set wards and keep an ear out for trouble. Davos used his seafaring stories to keep morale up, recounting times when he had faced storms on the narrow sea. The free folk snorted, uninterested in watery perils. "Give me a blizzard any day," one of them joked. On a particularly cold and stormy evening, they were forced to make camp near an abandoned watchtower in the Wolfswood. Snow fell in thick sheets, the wind shrieking like a banshee. Tormund, arms folded, gazed at the crumbling tower. "Better than nothing," he grunted. They set torches in the old cracks of the stone, found enough dryness inside to avoid the worst of the storm. Val and a few others hunted in the swirling dusk, managing to bring back a pair of hares. They roasted them over a small fire, the aroma of sizzling fat a brief delight in the midst of the cold and the gloom. As Tormund tore a chunk of meat from a spit, Davos approached, eyes scanning the darkness. "I don't like this storm," Davos said in a low voice. "Feels like it's hiding more than just cold." Tormund grunted, chewing. "You see something?" "Not sure," Davos admitted, "but I've got a feeling. Some of the men say they heard sounds in the woods. Footsteps, branches snapping. Could be animals, but it could be men stalking us." Tormund narrowed his eyes. "Well, if they come looking for a fight, they'll find it." He set his meal aside and stood, rolling his shoulders. "Let's have a watch set, 2 awake at all times." Val approached, overhearing. "I'll take the first watch," she volunteered. "My eyes are better in the dark than most." Tormund nodded, and she left the circle of warmth to find a vantage point in the tower's rubble. The night crept on, the storm piling snowdrifts against the old stones. Tormund dozed lightly, half ready for trouble. Nothing came that night but the unrelenting wind. By dawn, the clouds had parted, revealing a pale sun glinting off new-fallen snow as far as the eye could see. They pressed on, forging a path that only the occasional game trail or old road allowed. After almost a fortnight of travel, they turned back northeast toward Winterfell. No major skirmishes occurred, but Tormund was not blind to the pockets of resistance and suspicion. He saw the reluctant gazes, the closed shutters in villages, the men who reached for their swords when the free folk came near. Despite all that, Tormund also sensed a current of cautious hope. House Glover might not have knelt, but they had offered no violence. Smaller lordlings had done the same, and a handful of them had even come out to greet Tormund with the courtesy they might show a recognized king. The seeds of acceptance were planted. Whether they would grow or wither in the north's harsh climate, only time would tell. They arrived at Winterfell on a crisp morning, the castle's towers rising through a thin veil of fog. It felt almost like home to Tormund now, which was an odd sensation for a man who had spent most of his life calling tents or rocky caves home. The gates opened, and Sansa herself stood in the courtyard, flanked by a small retinue of northern guards. Tormund waved at her from afar, a grin splitting his face. She approached, her expression composed, a slight upturn at the corner of her mouth betraying relief. "Welcome back," she said. "How did it go?" Tormund stepped down from his horse, stretching. "No arrows in our backs, so that's a good start," he quipped. Then he grew more sober. "They're cautious. A few are downright unfriendly. But no one rose against me outright. It's a start." Sansa nodded. "That's better than I expected," she admitted quietly. "While you were gone, some letters arrived. Houses Manderley, Serwyn, and a few others have asked for a meeting to discuss relations. You're making an impression. They want to know if this is real or just a passing fancy." Tormund's eyes glinted. "A meeting, eh? So they come here, or do we go to them?" "They want to gather at Winterfell," Sansa answered. "Possibly in a fortnight. Enough time for them to travel safely and gather their retinues. I think it would be wise for you to host them. Show them your hospitality, your generosity. Let them see that you're not a savage warlord, but a king who wants peace. Tormund's gut twisted. Another test, but a necessary one. Then we'll do it, he said, rolling his shoulders again. A grand feast, if that's what they like. I'll have free folk cooking some of it so they can taste how we do things. Maybe we'll serve up the good ale. Show them we know how to drink better than any southern fancy lad. He grinned, though the tension in his eyes remained. Sansa's smile was thin, but genuine. We'll plan it carefully, she said. Don't worry. Over the next fortnight, Winterfell bustled with preparations. Though the ravages of war had left the storerooms diminished, hunts were organized to bring in deer and boars. Wagons trundled through the gates, laden with salted fish from the White Knife. The free folk offered their own supplies. Barrels of fermented goat's milk for their own strong brew, dried meats seasoned with strange northern herbs, sour berries that could be boiled into thick, tart sauces. Tormund insisted that the feast blend the traditions of both peoples. Let them taste something new, he told Sansa. Let them know we're not just about stolen cattle and raw meat. She agreed, albeit with reservations. The great hall was swept, the high table repaired. Banners of the direwolf remained, but Tormund also insisted on small emblems that represented the free folk tribes. Simple symbols carved into wood, hung near the hearth. Some of the northern servants grumbled about this, but Tormund's retinue helped, establishing an atmosphere of forced camaraderie as the day of the feast approached. Finally, the appointed day arrived. The gates of Winterfell swung open for the lords who had ventured across the icy roads. House Manderly arrived in style, with bright banners depicting the Merman of White Harbor. The Manderly retinue was large, including knights in shining mail, though their gear looked a bit battered from the war. Lord Wyman Manderly's son, Wyllis, came in his stead, for Lord Wyman was too corpulent and aged to travel easily. Wyllis was a portly man himself, good-natured, but no fool. He greeted Tormund with a stiff bow, which Tormund acknowledged with a grunt and a hearty handshake. House Serwyn came next, then House Flint, House Hornwood, and smaller houses that seldom saw the inside of Winterfell unless called by a Stark. They were greeted by Tormund and Sansa in the courtyard. Tormund tried to remember each face, each crest, though it was a challenge for a man who was more used to measuring a man's worth by how well he swung an axe. Night fell and torches lit the great hall. The long tables filled quickly, the lords and their retinues taking seats, uncertain of how to proceed with free folk mingling among them. Tormund took his seat at the head of the hall. Sansa stood at his right hand, Davos not far away, and Val sat to Tormund's left, meeting the gaze of the assembled lords with level confidence. The mood was tense, the air thick with unspoken judgments. Tormund stood to speak, clearing his throat. His voice, deep and carrying, boomed through the hall. Welcome to Winterfell, all of you. Some of you have traveled far. Some of you aren't sure why you're here. Maybe you think I'll say something clever to change your mind about me. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the tables. I'm not a clever man, but I know what I am. I'm Tormund Giantsbane, king in the north, and I say we are all better off as friends than enemies. He raised a cup of ale. So tonight, let us drink, let us eat, and maybe by the end, we'll see that there's no reason to fight. If we must talk politics, we'll talk tomorrow. Tonight, let's remember we survived the long night, all of us. And that's no small thing. He took a hearty swig of ale, and around the hall cups were raised. Some willingly, others begrudgingly. But all drank. That was enough for Tormund at the moment. Servants brought trenchers of food, some traditionally northern, roast venison, stewed onions and carrots, steaming loaves of bread, and some from the free folks' table. Roasted hare with wild berries, boiled goat's tongue, and the pungent fermented drink that made even some northerners scrunch their noses. The hush gradually gave way to a low hum of conversation. Tormund, between bites of meat, made an effort to lean toward the smaller houses' lords, asking about their harvest, or their concerns with the free folk. He tried his best to listen, to nod and grunt in acknowledgement, though subtlety was not his strength. Sansa offered measured, diplomatic replies, smoothing over any rough patches. Davos wandered the hall, speaking quietly with knights and men-at-arms, forging small connections. Val engaged in an animated discussion about wildling herbal remedies with a skeptical maester from White Harbor. Bit by bit, the tension softened, though it did not vanish. Tormund noticed that Lord Bolton's seat, once a seat of dread, remained empty, that line extinguished, and silently gave thanks that at least he did not have to deal with that name. He also saw that House Glover was not present. They had chosen not to come, sending only a note that said they would wait and see. Tormund scowled at that, but there was no help for it. As the feast wore on, a minstrel began to play a lute, singing a ballad about the victory against the dead. The free folk, unaccustomed to southern music, occasionally drummed on the table in rhythm. A few younger knights actually laughed with wildling warriors, passing flagons of ale back and forth. Tormund allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. Maybe, just maybe, they could build something here. Then came a moment Tormund dreaded. A question from Wylus Manderly, who had drunk enough ale to lose some of his tact, rang out across the table. "Your Grace," he said loudly. "Some of us wonder who will follow you when you pass on. Kings and lords think of heirs. Are we to assume the free folk do likewise? Or is the North to be thrown into chaos all over again when your time is done?" A hush fell as Tormund set his cup down. He felt eyes boring into him from every direction. The concept of inheritance among the free folk was foreign. They chose their leaders by respect and might, not by bloodline. But the lords and ladies of the North needed some semblance of continuity. Sansa cast him a sidelong look, as if to say, "Here is your chance to mention a marriage alliance." Tormund cleared his throat. "I'm not dead yet," he said, drawing a few awkward chuckles. He forced a grin. "But I understand your concern. The free folk aren't big on inheritance. My father didn't bequeath me a keep or titles. But I also know if we're to do this, we'll need something that both sides can believe in." He paused, feeling the pressure mount. "I've spoken with my council about the possibility of an alliance by marriage. Not because I'm craving a bride, but because it might be what's needed for the North to truly accept this new arrangement." A murmur rippled through the hall. Some looked intrigued, others suspicious. Wylus Manderly stroked his double chin thoughtfully. "A marriage, you say? And who would be your queen, then?" Tormund glanced at Sansa, who kept her face carefully neutral. He looked at Val, who stared back with a steady expression. He had known this moment might come. Would Val agree to marry him? She had never said outright. She was an independent soul, but she might consider it if she believed it would serve their people. But then Tormund also knew that the northern lords might prefer a match with a northern lady for the sake of tradition and acceptance. He raised his hands in a gesture of honesty. "That's not decided," he said. "But if there's a lord who'd have me wed his daughter, or if there's a lady who sees the sense in it, let's talk. I've got plenty of land, after all." A rough laugh rose in the hall at that. "And as for heirs, well, if the gods bless me with children, they'll be of both free folk and northern blood, and that might help all of us keep the peace." Some nodded slowly, seeing the logic. Others whispered among themselves, doubtless factoring in political gain. Val's face showed no resentment, only a calm acceptance of the realities. It was a conversation that would be had later in private. The tension in the hall resumed its gradual lessening. People returned to eating and drinking. Tormund, drained by the confrontation, sat back and exhaled. Sansa leaned in and whispered, "You handled that well enough." He scoffed lightly. "I sounded like a man haggling for a horse at the market. But if that's what they want, I'll do it." She smiled slightly. "It's what you need to do, for all our sakes." When the feast ended, Tormund was left with a tired sense of relief. The lords who attended would stay a few days at Winterfell, giving them time to discuss real terms. For now, they had at least broken bread together without drawing knives. Tormund watched as the guests were shown to their quarters, each group flanked by Winterfell guards. He then trudged to his own chambers, letting the swirl of concerns in his mind fade for a moment. He collapsed onto the bed, boots and all, letting out a long, ragged breath. Giantsbane, king in the north, he muttered to himself. You've gone mad. The next few days were filled with delicate negotiations. Lords Manderley and Serwyn, as well as representatives from House Hornwood, engaged in quiet talks about trade, the distribution of free folk across the north, and the question of a single code of law. Tormund was forced to sit through long sessions in Winterfell Solar, listening to intricacies about grain stores, hunting rights, and border disputes that made his head spin. Val occasionally attended, offering the free folk's perspective. Often, Tormund found himself relying on Sansa or Davos to phrase suggestions in a way the lords found palatable. For instance, when House Serwyn insisted that the free folk be confined to certain lands, Tormund's first response was, "We won't be caged like animals." But Davos reframed it as, "We propose designated areas for settlement, with fair access to resources, so we can avoid misunderstandings about territory." That sounded more civilized, and eventually, a compromise was reached where certain tracts of land near the new gift were opened for free folk settlement, while other areas remained strictly for the local lords. It wasn't perfect, and Tormund still felt a flare of resentment at the concept of fencing people in, but it was a step forward. In return, Tormund asked that the lords open their markets and roads to free folk, treating them as equal subjects rather than outlaws. That demand met resistance at first, but with Sansa's gentle prodding, they conceded that a free folk traveler could move through the north unmolested, so long as they respected local laws and customs. Tormund nearly rolled his eyes at the mention of laws and customs, but he bit his tongue. If the free folk wanted to live south of the wall, they would need to adapt some measure of these ways. As these negotiations continued, Tormund recognized that the cost of being king was 1,000 small compromises. He felt a pang of sorrow for the old days of wandering free as the wind. Yet he also remembered the bitterness of endless raids, the nights huddled in fear of White Walkers, the constant struggle against the wall. Maybe this was better if it meant his people would not freeze or starve so often. He tried to keep that in mind every time he swallowed his pride and played the part of a patient negotiator. One evening, after hours of talks, Tormund slipped away to the castle walls. The sky was clear, the stars piercing in their brilliance. He leaned on the ramparts, letting the cold air wash over him. The moonlight bathed the snowy courtyard below. He closed his eyes, recalling the howling northern wind beyond the wall, the night spent by a flickering fire with men and women who had no notion of kings or lords. A slight sound behind him made him turn. It was Val. She wrapped a fur cloak around herself and approached. "You look troubled," she said, her voice soft. Tormund shrugged. "I'm wondering if I did the right thing, putting on a crown, sitting in these damned meetings. I barely recognize myself." Val placed a hand on his arm. "Do you remember what Mance used to say? That we were all just men, that these divisions were illusions. He tried to bring our people south because the real enemy was out there in the cold and the dead. And you've helped finish what he started. He'd be proud." Tormund smiled wistfully. "Mance Raider, the king beyond the wall. Now here I am, the king in the north. Strange world." He looked at Val. "What about you? If I do this marriage, might it be you? Or would you prefer I marry some northern lady with a fancy name?" Val raised her chin, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "If it serves our people, I'd consider it. But I won't be some token in a Game of Thrones, Tormund. I'd stand by you as an equal or not at all." He reached out, gently squeezed her hand. "Aye, equal. That's how it should be." She looked away, a faint sadness in her features. "But you might gain more acceptance if you wed a northern house. Could cement your position. Even Sansa Stark, though I doubt she'd ever consider it, would be the strongest match. Or another of her kin. The lords would respect that. Your children would carry Stark blood. The free folk might not care about that, but the northerners do." Tormund exhaled, releasing a plume of fog into the air. The notion of wedding Sansa seemed absurd, and he suspected she would never agree. He also doubted he could handle her keen political mind day after day, in truth. And yet, the idea was out there, unspoken. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm not cut out for these fancy alliances." They stood in silence, the hush of winter enveloping them. In that quiet, Tormund remembered the many nights he had stared at the stars beyond the wall, wondering if there was a better life. Now he stood in the seat of House Stark, wearing a crown he never truly wanted. Yet he felt the call of destiny pulling him forward. He would not abandon his people or this cause. When the negotiations concluded after several more days, Tormund had secured a semblance of recognition from the assembled lords. They did not outright declare him their king, but they agreed to honor a truce, to permit the free folk settlement, and to hold further talks at midwinter to assess how the arrangement was working. It was as good as Tormund could have hoped for. A shaky partnership, one that hinged on him continuing to prove his worth. If he failed to keep order or to feed the North, they would surely turn on him. But for now, peace held. As the lords departed, Sansa pulled Tormund aside in the courtyard. "We did well," she said, sounding more relieved than triumphant. "But don't rest easy. There are those who resent this deeply, who think you a usurper. If they find an excuse to rise against you, they will." Tormund rubbed his temple. I know." He looked around at the busy yard, the swirl of activity as the guests departed. "But I'll keep trying. One day, I hope they see I'm not their enemy." Sansa nodded. "I'll remain at Winterfell to help. This is still my home, and I won't see it torn apart by fresh conflict. If you need counsel, come to me." He placed a meaty hand on her shoulder, a gesture that momentarily startled her, though she did not pull away. "You're all right, Lady Stark," he said, smiling. "Maybe you'd be a better king than me, but I appreciate the help." She allowed herself a small laugh. "I might not disagree with you on that," she said, her voice tinged with the faintest warmth. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Tormund in the swirl of departing retinues and drifting snow. He gazed at the swirling flakes, reflecting that this was only the beginning. Merging wildlings and northerners would be a long road, with no guarantee of success. There would be challenges from ambitious lords, old grudges flaring up, the endless logistical nightmares of feeding a kingdom scarred by war. And then there was the question of heirs and alliances, the question of whether Tormund would truly become a northern king in every sense. Yet for all the burdens, Tormund felt a spark of hope, stoked by every small kindness exchanged between free folk and Northmen, every handshake that replaced a drawn blade. Once, the wall had stood as a monument to fear and hatred between these peoples, but that wall, if not physically, at least symbolically, had fallen when the Night King was defeated. Now they were all just men and women of the North, fighting against the harsh winter and forging a new life. Tormund allowed a rare moment of self-reflection. He had once been a simple raider, proud of his freedom, scornful of southern lords. Now he was a king, forging treaties and planning feasts. Somewhere in the afterlife, Mance Raider might be laughing at the irony. Perhaps Tormund would laugh with him someday. For now, Tormund turned his thoughts to the next step, the day-to-day realities of rulership, ensuring that the free folk had roofs over their heads, that the northern lords saw reason to maintain the truce, that no one starved in the cold that lingered. The last of the lords' parties departed, leaving the courtyard quiet. Tormund pulled his fur cloak tighter around his broad shoulders. A swirl of wind carried the scent of pine from the distant wolfswood. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the battlements. He stood there a moment longer, feeling the weight of his improvised crown pressing down on him, invisible yet undeniably real. He turned and headed inside. There was much to do. He would gather his free folk chieftains, get their input on settlement boundaries, make sure they understood the importance of respecting the new agreements. He would check the state of Winterfell's granaries, coordinate hunts, and see to it that roads were cleared for trade. He would have quiet meetings with Sansa or Davos, planning the next steps carefully. If the North was to have a new king, one who bridged two worlds, it would require infinite patience and a spirit Tormund hoped he possessed. In the weeks that followed, the two peoples began living together in earnest. Clusters of free folk settled near abandoned farmsteads on the outskirts of Winterfell, some even taking up old homes that had fallen to ruin during the wars. Northerners grumbled about wildling neighbors, but gradually found themselves benefiting from their hunting prowess, from their knowledge of winter survival. Young free folk men learned how to repair plow harnesses from northern blacksmiths, while free folk women bartered animal hides for southern linens. Tormund heard whispers of friction, drunken brawls, name-calling, theft, but so far, it hadn't erupted into widespread violence. He dealt with each issue swiftly, sometimes imposing punishments that surprised both sides with their fairness, if not their severity. "Steal from your neighbor, and you owe him twice what you took," Tormund would declare. "Attack a neighbor with a blade, and we'll take your blade hand." That last was mostly a threat, but it proved an effective deterrent. Amid these daily struggles, letters arrived from across the north. Some told of minor lords who questioned Tormund's right to tax or demand men for a watch on the neck. Others were from large houses, acknowledging him more openly, even beginning their letters with the salutation to His Grace, Tormund Giantsbane, King in the North. Tormund found those letters odd, as if they referred to someone else. But he recognized that each was another step in forging a new identity for the North. As the snows deepened, Tormund embraced the challenge. He personally led hunting parties into the forests, returning with game that stocked Winterfell's stores. He would share a horn of ale with the men and women who accompanied him, praising them openly for their skill. He visited outlying settlements, sometimes braving the fiercest whether to reassure the people that they had not been forgotten. In these acts, Tormund found a kind of purpose that transcended sitting on a throne. If he was to be king, he would do it in his own style, never losing the rough camaraderie that defined him. He also discovered that his stories of giants, of wights, of climbing the wall, spread through the small folk like wildfire. Children flocked to hear him spin exaggerated tales, and Tormund, ever the showman, would hoist a child onto his knee and regale them with accounts of how he wrestled a giant's wife. Northerners would snort with amusement or roll their eyes, but many found themselves quietly charmed. There was something genuine about a king who told stories by the fireside, who laughed as heartily as the poorest farmer might laugh at a bawdy joke. The seeds of unity, however fragile, were planted in those small moments. When the day's labors ended, free folk and Northmen alike would huddle around a fire, share an ale, and for a moment, forget the centuries of blood between them. Tormund oversaw it all, carrying the hopes of both sides like a yoke across his broad shoulders. Occasionally, though, dire reports reached Winterfell. Some said that scattered remnants of the dead still roamed the far north, or that small bands of outlaws had taken advantage of the disarray. Tormund dispatched rangers, both free folk and Northmen, to investigate. They often returned with stories of finding nothing, but once in a while, they would discover a burned homestead or a group of travelers robbed of their belongings. Tormund vowed that such lawlessness would be crushed. "We survived the dead," he said to the men he sent out. "We won't be torn apart by the living." In the quieter moments, Tormund reflected on where the real threats lay. Was it the ragged outlaws in the forests, or the proud lords in their keeps who might still see him as an impostor? Likely both. And so he played the game, though he did it in the only way he knew, forthright, with more muscle than subtlety, but with a willingness to compromise that often surprised his foes. Time passed, and the midwinter gathering approached. Tormund decided that once again, he would host it in Winterfell. This time, the outcome would be critical. Would the lords accept him as their rightful king, or would they decide to break away? The free folk, too, would come to air their grievances. Tormund braced himself for the storm of words. Yet as that day neared, an unexpected visitor arrived at Winterfell's gates. A man in black, riding a sturdy horse, face half hidden by a hood against the biting cold. Tormund happened to be inspecting the training yard when the rider was let in. He felt a jolt of surprise as he recognized the man's features under the hood. Jon Snow, the former king in the north, the man who had abdicated to Daenerys Targaryen, fought the Great War, then vanished beyond the wall when all was done. Jon dismounted, looking uncertain, his dark eyes flicking over Tormund's retinue. "Tormund," he said simply, the ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. Tormund let out a whoop of delight, crossing the yard in a few bounding strides and enveloping Jon in a fierce hug that nearly lifted him off his feet. "Jon Bloody Snow," he roared. "You're back, you old sour crow." Jon coughed, patting Tormund's broad back. "I heard rumors that a wildling king in the north sat on the Stark seat. I had to see it for myself." Tormund released him, eyes gleaming. "Come inside, warm yourself. I'll get you a drink. Gods, it's good to see you." And so Jon entered Winterfell once more, the place he had once called home. Servants gaped, free folk stared, uncertain how to greet him. They knew him as the man who had led them to salvation, the one who had brokered peace between free folk and the Night's Watch. Tormund took Jon to a small solar, where Sansa joined them with wide eyes and a stunned expression. She embraced Jon, her face lit with relief and a swirl of complicated emotion. The three of them settled by the fire, while Davos quietly slipped in, greeting Jon with a respectful nod. Jon looked tired, as though he carried the weight of many journeys on his shoulders. "I've been beyond the wall," he said softly. "I needed peace to escape the politics, but word reached me of this new kingdom." His gaze landed on Tormund. "I didn't think you'd actually do it." Tormund shrugged, a broad grin on his face. "Didn't think so either, but here we are. Sansa's been guiding me, telling me not to do anything too foolish." He threw her a fond look. "And we're making progress, Jon. It's not perfect, but we're forging something new." Jon's expression remained unreadable. "I'm glad to see the free folk and the North aren't at each other's throats." He turned to Sansa. "And you? Are you all right with this?" Sansa inclined her head. "Better than another war. Tormund has been surprisingly capable. And you know the free folk have as much claim to live without fear of the others as anyone." Jon nodded, leaning forward in his chair. "I'm not here to challenge you, Tormund. I have no interest in a crown or in telling you what to do. But the North is my home, and my family sits here. I wanted to see for myself." Tormund reached out, clasping Jon's arm. "You're welcome here, always. The people still respect you, you know. Some might wonder if you'd—" Jon cut him off, shaking his head firmly. "I won't be king. I've had my fill of crowns and thrones." His tone softened. "But if you need my help, my sword or my counsel, you have it." In that moment, Tormund felt a sense of relief. Jon Snow's tacit blessing would carry weight with those who still questioned Tormund's legitimacy. If the man who had united the free folk and the Night's Watch accepted Tormund as king, perhaps others would follow. He told Jon as much. "Your support means a lot," he said. "We have a gathering soon. The lords will be here, the free folk chiefs. Maybe you could lend your voice. Show them this is what you want for the North." Jon hesitated, gazing into the fire. "I'll speak for you," he said at last. "If it keeps the peace, if it helps you move forward. But after that, I may leave again. I'm not made for lording over people." Tormund nodded. He understood. Jon had always been a man caught between worlds, never entirely comfortable in any of them. "Thank you, Jon Snow." They clinked cups, Sansa exhaled quietly, and Davos offered a small smile. For a few moments, a sense of camaraderie and hope filled the solar, reminiscent of the days when they had all stood together against the dead. Tormund, the wildling king in the north, felt more confident than ever that he could bridge these worlds. Free folk and northerners, tradition, and change. If the gods were good, the realm might finally know lasting peace. Of course, winter was long and merciless, and the hearts of men could be colder still. But Tormund would face that as he had faced every challenge, with roaring laughter, unwavering loyalty, and the fierce determination of a man who had once been told he could never set foot south of the wall without being called an enemy. Now he called it home, and he wore a crown upon his head. He thought of the uncertain roads ahead, the new alliances that must be forged, the possible marriage that might still loom in his future. He thought of the lords who would arrive soon, the free folk chieftains who would test his resolve. And he thought of the nights by the fire, telling stories to children who looked at him with awe, imagining him as some giant-slaying hero. In all these thoughts, Tormund found a sense of purpose. He would be the king in the north who carved a path for two peoples to stand as one. He would merge Wildling and Northerner not through conquest, but through shared labor, shared feasts, and shared burdens. As he finished his cup, feeling its warmth spread through his belly, Tormund grinned at Jon Snow. "Welcome home," he said. Jon only nodded, his eyes drifting to the fire once more. So ended one chapter of the North story and began another. Tormund Giantsbane, raider, warrior, friend, had crowned himself king in the north and, to the surprise of all, had not immediately plunged the land into bloodshed. Instead, he and the people who followed him, whether free folk or old northern houses, were forging a future unlike any that the Seven Kingdoms had seen before. The snows still fell, the nights were still long, and the challenges immense, but in the flickering torchlight of Winterfell, where a wildling sat on a rough wooden seat draped in furs, there was hope. And for the north, beaten down by war and darkness, hope was a spark that might yet kindle a bright new dawn.